Murder of James Bulger, a boy, stolen in England. It began on an ordinary Friday afternoon, February 12, 1993, at a busy shopping center in Bootle, near Liverpool. Parents were shopping, children played, and the world outside carried on like any other day. But on the grainy black and white CCTV footage, one moment of innocence was about to turn into horror. A small boy in a blue jacket holding his mother's hand walked into a store. His name was James Bulger, just 2 years old. Within minutes, his mother, Denise, turned away to pay for something. When she looked back, her son was gone. What she didn't know was that two other children had been watching. 10-year-olds John Venables and Robert Thompson, just kids themselves, were wandering the mall unsupervised. They weren't there to shop or play. They had been kicked out of school earlier that day and were roaming the area looking for mischief. But as security cameras would later show, what they did next was far from harmless. At 3:42 p.m., the CCTV caught them holding little James by the hand, walking him calmly out of the mall. To the other shoppers, it looked almost sweet. Two older boys helping a lost toddler. No one stopped them. No one thought twice. And that was the beginning of one of the most shocking child abduction cases in modern history. When Denise realized her son was missing, panic hit like lightning. She searched the store aisles, shouting his name. Security was alerted, announcements echoed through the building, and within minutes a full-scale search began. But James and his two new companions were already gone. They had slipped into the crowded streets, disappearing toward the nearby canal and train line. That evening, as police cars combed the city and parents were told to keep children indoors, a witness came forward. A woman said she'd seen two boys walking with a small child near a park. Another report came from someone who saw the same trio at a railway embankment. The older boys seemed to be leading the toddler somewhere. I thought they were brothers, one witness later said. The little one looked too trusting. For 48 hours, the search for James Bulger consumed Britain. The media broadcast his face everywhere. Volunteers joined police to scour woods, fields, and alleyways. Hundreds of calls flooded in. But the most haunting image remained that CCTV still. James, tiny and trusting, holding hands with two older boys. Then, on Sunday morning, February 14th, the nightmare ended. A group of children playing near a railway line in Walton, a few miles from the shopping center, stumbled upon something. They ran home screaming. Police rushed to the scene. What they found confirmed every parent's worst fear. The discovery shocked even hardened officers, but there was something else that froze them. Something that didn't fit the pattern of any ordinary abduction. The evidence suggested this was not the work of an adult predator or a planned kidnapping. It pointed towards something far more disturbing. Investigators noticed the size of the footprints around the area. They were small, too small. And near the tracks, someone had left a small jar of blue paint, smeared and spilled. Detectives began connecting the dots. Witnesses had described seeing two young boys with James. Now, the evidence at the scene matched that story. Could it really be that children had done this? Within hours, police were scouring the area for any lead. They collected the CCTV footage from the Bootle shopping center and slowed it frame by frame. The image was blurry but unmistakable. Two boys, one slightly taller, the other with a round face, leading James by the hand. The investigators were silent as they watched. This wasn't what anyone expected, the entire team essayed. And in disbelief, one detective whispered, "They're just kids." The footage was broadcast on national television. Britain watched in shock as the video looped endlessly. The police asked the public to help identify the boys in the film. Within a day, dozens of calls poured in. One caller said she recognized one of the boys from her neighborhood, and his name was John Venables. Another call named the second boy, Robert Thompson. Both were just 10 years old. When detectives arrived at their homes, they didn't find hardened criminals or runaway teenagers. They found 2 children in school uniforms sitting with their parents. But when questioned, their answers didn't match. Venables cried almost immediately, saying he didn't mean to hurt anyone. Thompson stayed calm, cold, and quiet. The contrast between them was unsettling. For investigators, the question wasn't just who anymore. It was why. What could possibly drive 2 10-year-olds to take a child from a shopping center and lead him to such a tragic end? Over the next days, police pieced together a timeline. Witnesses recalled seeing the boys at the shopping center earlier, stealing candy, batteries, and paint. They had tried to approach other small children before James, attempts that had failed when mothers intervened. This wasn't random. It had been planned. They were searching for a victim. When the truth began to surface, the public's grief turned into outrage. Newsrooms were flooded with calls demanding justice. Tabloids called the boys monsters. Politicians were forced to respond. For the first time in modern history, Britain was confronting the reality that even children could commit acts once thought impossible. As the investigation continued, more chilling details came to light. The route Venables and Thompson took that day was over 2 miles long. Along the way, dozens of people saw them with James, but no one intervened. Everyone assumed the toddler was a younger brother. In hindsight, that assumption haunted the nation. If just one person had stopped them, an officer later said, this never would have happened. The police interviews with the boys stretched late into the night. Both gave conflicting stories, each blamed the other, but then came the moment that changed everything. One of the detectives placed a piece of the CCTV footage on the table. "That's you, isn't it?" he asked. The boy looked down, his lips trembled. Then almost inaudibly he said yes. That single word broke the case wide open. But as detectives dug deeper into their statements, one thing became clear. This wasn't just about crime. It was about something darker. Both boys came from homes marked by neglect and abuse. Both had histories of truancy, anger, and loneliness. Society had failed them long before they failed James. Still, no explanation could make sense of what had happened. The crime was too senseless, the loss too great. And as the investigation turned into preparation for trial, Britain braced itself for what was to come. A courtroom drama unlike any it had ever seen. When the trial opened, reporters from around the world packed into the small courtroom. But the nation wasn't ready for what it was about to hear. Because behind the walls of that courtroom, a story was waiting to unfold that would redefine justice, childhood, and the meaning of evil itself. The faces of John Venables and Robert Thompson filled every newspaper in Britain. 2 10-year-olds, accused of one of the most shocking crimes in modern history. People couldn't believe it. How could children so young be capable of something so dark? Outside police stations, crowds gathered, demanding answers. Reporters camped on the streets and headlines screamed, "Evil has a face." Inside the investigation rooms, detectives faced an impossible task, questioning 2 frightened children about a crime no adult could even comprehend. Both boys sat at separate tables, flanked by social workers and parents. They looked small, barely reaching the edge of the desk, but what came out of their mouths would shake the entire country. John Venables cried often, wiping his nose on his sleeve, asking for his mom. "I didn't mean it," he whispered over and over. But when officers showed him the CCTV photo, he broke. "That's me," he said softly. "That's Robert." Robert Thompson, on the other hand, was calm, too calm. He denied everything at first, then shifted blame. "John wanted to take him," he said. "I just followed." His voice stayed steady, his eyes dry. Investigators couldn't tell if he was scared or simply detached. Piece by piece, the story began to emerge. The 2 boys had skipped school that morning. wandering from store to store inside the Strand shopping center. They had tried to lure other children before James, but each time adults stepped in. Until finally, they found one moment when no one was looking. They walked with James for more than 2 miles, passing dozens of people. Some even stopped and asked if the little boy was lost. "He's our brother," one of the boys said, and they kept going. No one followed. The police traced their route street by street, matching witness statements and footprints. Every step made the truth harder to bear. They hadn't just found James by chance. They had been looking for a victim all day. When officers told the boys that James was dead, John broke down completely, sobbing uncontrollably. Robert's face, however, didn't change. "He was fine when we left him," he said quietly. His denial, even after all the evidence, sent chills through the room. In March 1993, the trial began at Preston Crown Court. Because of their age, the boys couldn't be tried as adults, but the courtroom was arranged so the judge could see them clearly. 2 small figures in oversized suits, barely visible behind the desks. The judge, lawyers, and even reporters struggled with the surreal scene. The prosecution laid out the timeline with cold precision. The CCTV footage, the witness accounts, the items found near the railway, the small fingerprints that matched both boys. Piece by piece, the story became undeniable. The defense argued they were too young to understand the gravity of their actions, that they didn't fully know right from wrong. But for the public, that wasn't enough. Outside the courthouse, angry crowds shouted for justice. The nation was grieving, not just for James Bulger, but for what his death represented, the loss of innocence itself. Inside the courtroom, John and Robert sat quietly listening as the evidence unfolded. John's eyes filled with tears again and again. Robert stared at the floor. When James's mother, Denise, took the stand, the entire room fell silent. Her voice trembled as she spoke about the moment she looked away and the nightmare that followed. Even hardened reporters wiped tears from their eyes. After weeks of testimony, the jury reached its verdict. On November 24, 1993, the 2 boys were found guilty of the abduction and murder of James Bulger. At just 10 years old, they became the youngest convicted murderers in modern British history. The judge called the crime unparalleled in modern times. When the verdict was read, John began to cry uncontrollably. Robert remained still, his lips pressed together. Outside, crowds cheered, believing justice had finally been served. But behind the celebration, a deeper question lingered. What would happen to these 2 children now? The court ruled that both boys would be detained indefinitely, held in secure youth facilities until further notice. Their names, faces, and crimes were burned into the nation's memory. But the story wasn't over, not even close. As the world debated whether justice had truly been done, something else was happening behind closed doors. Something that would reignite the fury years later. Because even after prison, even after years of therapy and secrecy, the shadows of that day would never disappear. And when one of the boys grew up and made headlines again, the world realized that the case of James Bulger was far from over. The verdict had been read, the cameras had stopped flashing, and Tane tried to move on, but the James Bulger case refused to fade. The story lingered in every home, every newspaper, every conversation about crime and childhood. It was no longer just a case, but it had become a mirror reflecting the darkest questions of society. After the trial, John Venables and Robert Thompson, both just 10 years old at the time of the crime, were sent to separate secure youth facilities. They were the youngest convicted murderers in modern British history. For their safety, the government placed them under new identities, fearing public retaliation. The country was divided. Half demanded punishment, the other half demanded understanding. Inside the facilities, the boys grew up under supervision. They were given tutors, counselors, and strict routines. They weren't treated like adults, but they weren't treated like children either. Officials said they needed to be retrained to live among society. Reports later suggested Robert adjusted well, quiet, withdrawn, and eager to follow the rules. John, however, struggled. He often cried, became anxious, and showed flashes of anger. At night, guards sometimes found him awake, staring at the ceiling, whispering, "I didn't mean to." Outside those walls, the world couldn't forgive. The British public was furious that the boys were protected, educated, and cared for, while the Bulger family lived with heartbreak. Every new article reignited outrage. Crowds held signs reading "Justice for James," and "Evil never grows old." In 2001, when both boys turned 18, they were released. The government announced they had been rehabilitated and were no longer a danger to society. They were given new names and new identities, their records sealed forever. The court ruled that revealing who or where they were would be a criminal offense. It was meant to protect them from being hunted down, but to many, it felt like betrayal. James's mother, Denise Bulger, spoke out publicly. "They stole my son," she said, "and they get to live free like nothing happened." Her pain reignited national anger. People wanted answers. Could anyone ever truly forgive what had happened? For a while there was silence. Both boys disappeared into anonymity. But in 2010, headlines exploded again. John Venables had been arrested once more, this time for possessing illegal material online. The nation was outraged. "He hasn't changed," people said. "He never will." The government revoked his freedom, sending him back to prison. The public demanded to know how someone who had been given a second chance could return to darkness. Meanwhile, Robert Thompson remained hidden. Reports claimed he had built a quiet life, working under a new name. He hadn't reoffended. The government kept his identity secret, fearing public backlash if it ever surfaced. Some said he lived with guilt every day. Others believed he wanted to disappear completely from the world that once knew him. The case forced Britain to change its laws. Juvenile justice was reformed. Police procedures for missing children were tightened. Schools increased focus on emotional welfare and early warning signs. Yet none of it could erase the memory of the grainy CCTV image. Two boys leading a toddler by the hand, unaware that they were about to change history. 3 decades later, the case of James Bulger still grips the public. Documentaries, films, and debates revisit it year after year, but the answers remain the same: heartbreaking, complicated, and unclear. Some see it as a failure of the system. Others see it as proof that even innocence can be lost too soon. Every February, flowers and toys appear near the railway line where James was found. Strangers who weren't even alive in 1993 leave notes reading, "We will never forget you, James." His name has become a symbol of the fragility of innocence and the depth of human sorrow. The story of James Bulger is not just a tragedy. It's a question that still echoes across generations. Can evil is in a child, or is it something we create? No one has ever answered that question, and maybe no one ever will. But one truth remains: the world remembers